Hi, I'm Beth Osborne. I'm the Director of Transportation for America. We are a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit that focuses on creating a transportation system in the United States that connects people to jobs and essential services, no matter their financial means or their physical ability. We do our work through direct technical assistance to local governments that are seeking to improve access for drivers and non-drivers alike, through analysis and research about how the existing transportation system is functioning, and through direct advocacy and policy development. We're part of a larger organization called Smart Growth America that is focused on the built environment, transportation being a key part of what impacts the built environment. Right now in the United States, we have a lot of opportunity to change transportation policy. There are a lot of legislative and executive action possibilities that I'm going to address. Right now, with the new administration, the Biden administration, and a democratically controlled Congress, there is more coordination amongst the legislative branch and the executive branch than we typically have. There are several legislative vehicles. One is our regular reauthorization of our existing transportation programs, which takes place every 5 to 6 years. We have our regular annual spending bills, which includes transit funding, though in the United States, highway funding is trust funded. We take in funding through gas tax, and it is protected from being moved in the spending bills. We have the White House's proposal called the American Jobs Plan, which includes a major boost in funding for highways, transit, and rail, as well as a program to reconnect neighborhoods that have been divided by transit, or particularly by highways, often through Black and brown neighborhoods. We also have a slew of executive actions that I'll talk about. But before I get into all that, I just want to set the scene of what we have inherited in the United States and what needs to be fixed. So back in the early 20th century, the federal government entered into an exercise called redlining, where they used red to indicate which neighborhoods were undesirable. They were often Black neighborhoods or other kinds of racial minorities. And what you will notice is that is exactly where the highways were put through. So this is Oakland, California. The map, the old map, is a little askew, but you'll notice that the highways are built right through that red point. We see this across the country. This is my hometown of New Orleans, and this is a neighborhood called Treme, which is not only a historically Black neighborhood, but a very important neighborhood in New Orleans. It was certainly not a poor neighborhood. It was a professional, middle class, upper middle class Black neighborhood. And we put a highway right down the beautiful boulevard in the middle of Treme. In other places, like in Atlanta, they not only divided Black neighborhoods, but they took way more land than you saw in New Orleans, cutting a huge swath through these neighborhoods, and in many places displacing a good portion of that neighborhood. We like to pretend many times that these mistakes are in the distant past, but this is an example of a project conducted in Kansas City that was completed in 2002. And there are many examples of highway expansions going on right now that further exacerbate the damage done by the placement of these highways in the past. In the fall, my CEO of Smart Growth America, my boss, put a notice up of our proposal to bridge these dividing highways or these damaging highways, or possibly take them down, and asked folks across the country for examples of such highways. And we got over 300 responses in terms of other examples, pretty much in every metropolitan area in the country, of usually Black neighborhoods that were severely damaged by highways. When we started taking on putting things back together, this is Rochester, New York, where you can see they dug a trench through a Black neighborhood there. But in recent years, through a competitive grant program at the U.S. Department of Transportation, began to knit that community back together, recapturing land for development and reconnecting that community to downtown jobs. We also have examples in places like New York City, where we took away a riverside highway, and when we did, we put in a linear park. And what's interesting here is while a lot of people in the United States stress that if there's any less territory made available for highways, that immediately traffic congestion will overwhelm us, but we saw thousands of daily trips just evaporate. This is not just happening in the Northeast and in big cities. In Greenville, South Carolina, a beautiful place I highly recommend visiting. They removed a bridge that blocked a waterfall and created a beautiful pedestrian bridge that has become a hub for folks visiting. Now, the reason I point these things out is they have huge equity impacts in terms of just replacing infrastructure, because if we replace it in kind, we get 50 more years of the damage we created. We're also seeing that this very highway-centric, high-speed vehicle-centric approach results in some pretty serious implications for climate, transportation being the largest sector contributing to CO2 emissions, and along with it, it's also connecting or creating criteria pollutant emissions. Those are the emissions that interfere with public health. We have undercut past efficiencies that we have created in vehicle standards by building such a highway-centric system and car-centric system that other options aren't available. So cars get more efficient, people drive more, and you still end up with more pollution. It requires an EV strategy to be total before it's really effective. We also like to point out that just the roadway system and all the system put in place for cars can result in major hazards to the environment, public health, and CO2 emissions and climate emissions. The tires can emit. We have a greenhouse warming effect in neighborhoods that have too much pavement, things like that. And even if we're able to clean up the system, we have seen a historic increase in fatalities in the United States. The latest complete data available is 2019. We saw a 45% increase between 2010 and 2019 in fatalities and pedestrians. Well, last year, we had some preliminary data, and while we saw traffic go down a great deal, about 13 or 14%, we saw fatalities go up a great deal, about 8%. And so it was the largest increase in traffic fatalities the traffic fatality rate in 96 years. Now, what's important about this is to recognize that our focus on highways, even in neighborhoods, even in highly developed areas, puts the priority on speed over safety, and speed is incompatible with safety. And the people who suffer the most in the United States for this are Black and Native Americans, who are overwhelmingly likely to be killed as a pedestrian. And that's simply because they're less likely to own an automobile, and they're more likely to be in neighborhoods that were unable to fight for safer roads. And all of this is done because of our fear of traffic congestion in the United States. Now, in spite of our fear and ever thirsty highways for more space and the billions and billions we spend every year in expanding our highways, we only succeed in creating more traffic. But in the United States, we don't really acknowledge that induced demand, the notion that when you provide more free space, people fill it up, either with additional trips at peak hours that they wouldn't have taken otherwise, new developments that add traffic to the roadway. And we have spent years seeing this phenomenon, but it is generally not acknowledged, not at the federal level, not at any state level. And that's in spite of the first acknowledged proof of this concept being found in Missouri back in the 1930s. So not very quick on the uptake in the United States. Adding capacity, we know, doesn't work. We did a study of how much states are spending on freeway expansion compared to population growth, and we find that while they're spending more, they're more than keeping up with population growth, that we're seeing an explosion in traffic congestion. This is true in places that have vastly overspent their their population growth. So they're building considerably more freeway capacity than the population is growing. We're seeing a major increase in congestion even where population is shrinking that is because of our development patterns, which we choose to ignore in transportation. We like to pretend that the land use patterns have no impact on whether or not our roadways function, whether or not transit is possible, whether or not walking and biking is possible. It's interesting because the federal government was an instrumental part of setting our sprawling land use patterns that has undercut the efficiency of our roadways. And we have set up a system that seems to create the maximum amount of congestion with the fewest number of people. And yet it is not even a consideration when we're putting together our transportation plans or considering transportation projects. My organization has been pushing Congress and the administration to consider a new approach in policy, one that prioritizes maintaining the current system before building new things. Our current law allows states, who are the primary managers of the transportation program, to build new highways while existing highways and bridges are crumbling. We have examples of states like in Alabama that's spending over $5 billion to build a bypass of a city called Birmingham, while they have hundreds of bridges in disrepair. That bypass is projected to reduce congestion in Birmingham by 1%, and that is the 85th most congested city in the country. So it has very little benefit, and they're spending all their money there instead of where it's really needed. We also focus on safety over speed, on measuring whether or not our transportation system is actually connecting people to jobs and essential services, something that can be measured with a use of GIS, basically what we use Google Maps for, but we have, instead of using those technologies in our transportation program, have chosen to use tools that we developed in the 1940s and 50s instead. So the things sorry, I'm going to stay here. The things that we are focused on right now is getting some of those development regulations out of the way so we can build more traditional compact development that makes it easier for people to move around. Making safety the top priority in street design, and so that we can encourage more short trips, but also so that we can actually save lives. Instituting a greenhouse gas reduction measure and measuring induced demand, so we can get rid of the mythology that by reducing congestion, we actually lower greenhouse gases, something that you hear in the United States a lot. Invest heavily in other options for getting around. And particularly on that point, a highway style investment in transit with operating support. We don't support transit anywhere near the level of highways. Highways get 80% of federal funding, while transit gets 20% of funding. And at the state level, many states have a constitutional prohibition against spending any user fees collected from drivers on transit, even transit that rides on the same roadways as those cars. And we don't support operating funds either at the federal level, and very few states do either. So these are things that we want to see change. We want to look to reconnect those neighborhoods that have been divided by highways. I make sure we're not continuing to expand those highways and further damage those communities. The administration recently put a halt temporarily on a highway in Houston, Texas, that would displace about 1,000 homes that are generally filled with people of color, families of color. We'll see if they have the power to actually stop it permanently. That's a big question. And we're pushing the U.S. Department of Transportation very hard to utilize its authority to update guidebooks and rules to address climate, resilience, equity, and building local economies. These are powers that have been in place for a long time, but the U.S. Department of Transportation has taken a very hands-off approach to managing the transportation program, encouraging better measurement of results, and improving the overall outcomes, instead deferring everything to the states, which is frankly what Congress has intended as well. We're hoping that Congress and the administration will take a different direction, but right now, while we have a lot of good statements and exciting proposals, we have a long way to go before we know that those proposals turn into actual programs with better results. So that's the update from the United States, and I appreciate being included in the conference.